such an important milestone for such an important event. Dr. King's visit here in 1963, and of course, the fact that he gives this speech, or a version of this very pivotal speech in his career, for the first time here. But let's start with how this all comes together. What brought Martin Luther King to Detroit in the summer of 1963 and gave him the opportunity to give this speech at Cobo Hall?
Well, it's a great question, Stephen. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand or maybe miss what happened in Detroit coming up to 1963. As you know, the Reverend C.L. Franklin of New Bethel Baptist Church was really the sort of lead on putting together the march in Detroit in 1963. He looked at it as a pivotal point in Detroit's history as it related to African Americans. He looked at the 63 march as going back to 1943 and the race riot that happened in the city, largely white folk going to Black communities and destroying property and possessions there. What Reverend Franklin and others wanted to do in 1963 is point out some of the very same inequities that were happening in 1943. They wanted to point out that those same inequities were still in place, still happening in 1963, even though African Americans, particularly as individuals in 1963, by 1963, had reached a tenor of economic, political, and social success. Right? Let's just go back several years before that. Charles Diggs becomes the first African American in Michigan to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. That was 1955. And then in 1957, William Patrick becomes the first African American to serve on what they called at that time the Common Council.
Common Council, yeah.
What we call today the City Council. Patrick becomes the first Black to serve on that body since the 1880s. But at the same time, out of a 5,000 member police force, in 1963, fewer than 300 of those people, men and women, were Black. And the reality was, it took until 1963 when African American children became the majority of pupils enrolled at Detroit public schools. And so couple that with the race discrimination carried out in the housing market, even in the public and private sector, even downtown and City Hall. What Reverend Franklin and Reverend Albert Clegg and the great Tony Brown, of course, no stranger to Detroit Public Television, really the sort of predecessor in a way of Detroit Black Journal and American Black Journal. Those three gentlemen and others formed the Council for Human Rights, Detroit Council for Human Rights. And that was the body that put together the 63 March that featured, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, and we should remind folks that, I feel like Martin Luther King, in retrospect, is a mythical character. Somebody that it's almost impossible to get anybody to say something negative about. But in 1963, he was not popular in a lot of quarters, and was thought to be something of a rabble rouser, of a troublemaker, right?
He was in the vernacular, I think Public Enemy used this phrase 30 years ago. He was a controversial Negro.
Yeah.
And so much so, and you know this story well, we had a chance as reporters to interview people like the late Arthur Johnson, at one time the Detroit NAACP executive director and later president. Arthur Johnson wrote in his memoir a dozen years ago or so before he passed that the NAACP did not support the march.
That's right.
Did not support, and that, to sort of think about that in terms, maybe for millennials and others, they might say, why was that? But as you pointed out, King was, people felt like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and others were moving a little too fast. It wasn't that the NAACP didn't support Dr. King's vision and the Detroit Council for Human Rights' vision. They just felt like a slower, more thoughtful path was the better way to go.
Yeah, yeah. And so he comes, and there's this march, and 125,000 people show up, which even at that time, with the city being much bigger, that's just an enormous number of folks. Talk about the impact, though, of that day and this speech he gives at Cobo Hall, which of course would become much more famous when he gives it in Washington.
Absolutely. Of course, as you pointed out, it happens a couple of months earlier that summer, before the famous March on Washington. He gives the "I Have a Dream" speech. What really begins to happen after that, and it takes time. Detroit has a rebellion 4 years later, so things didn't become markedly or dramatically different. But if I think about, and there's a great photo, shared it on your broadcast in past years, a great photo of that march that has people like UAW President Walter Reuther, your grandfather, William Beckham, who served as a leader in the UAW, had Dr. King, and others. But it also had a gentleman named George Harge, and a gentleman who's probably not known by many people our age or younger. But immediately after the 1963 march, Harge is made a major official in the Detroit Police Department, in part because of his body of work over the years. But he did participate in the Detroit Walk to Freedom. People also forget that even though the NAACP didn't support that march, the Detroit's young mayor, Jerome Kavanaugh, did embrace that march and helped Reverend Franklin and others obtain the permits, and the various things it takes to take on a massive movement like that, one-day movement. The city embraced that march and movement, and I only point that out to say it was blacks and whites working together. The Jewish community was there's a long relationship between the Jewish community and the Black community, and civil rights and union representation. And so they played a major part in it too. So you started to see people like Harge ascend to leadership. 2 years later, a pastor at Plymouth Congregational Church who participated in that march, a man that you and I know well, the Reverend Nicholas Hood Sr., and his young sons participated in that march. Reverend Hood was elected to the Detroit Common Council a couple years later, and then the rest is history. Coleman Young becomes the first Black mayor 10 years later.
Yeah. It's really this kind of pivotal momentum, I guess, point that sends us forward as a community.
And it took time, my friend. It took time. It did not happen. It did not happen overnight.
That's right. There's a lot of struggle ahead of that, including this rebellion that happens in '67 that really does remind people of the inequalities that people are living with. Quickly before we have to end, talk about 60 years later, what young Detroiters in particular ought to draw from Dr. King's visit here and that moment, and what happens after.
Well, what I'm hoping is, and I haven't had these conversations, so I'm sort of talking about this, and at least in terms of my reaction to your question. I hope that city institutions, both public, private, foundations, embrace the 60th anniversary of this march, just like we embraced the 50th remembrance of the rebellion. As you know, and your programming has represented, there was a large body of people from all walks of life that took 2 or 3 years to kind of look back at 1967. What were we able to achieve as a community? What did we not do? And what can we leave behind for current and future generations? It is my hope, Stephen, that there is that type of attention paid to the 60th anniversary this march. Programming for people of all ages, collecting oral histories from people who were there. And obviously 60 years ago, there aren't a whole lot of people around anymore, but there are some. I've talked to some in my reporting and research over the years. And so what I hope is that it is a teachable moment, as the phrase goes, one where we can all remember, some can learn, but we can find ways to move forward.